Everybody's in the room. My name is Paulo Di Maria. I'm the president and CEO of the National Association of State Boards of Education. And this webinar is Rethinking the Principalship, Key Considerations for States. Before we start, I always like to make sure to set some norms. I would encourage you to begin by changing your name to include either your state affiliation, if you happen to be a state Board of Education member or another state agency member or what have you. And then otherwise, if you're not, add the name of your organization. We always like to know who we have in the room because it helps us shape what it is we talk about. I also want to share my appreciation for those of you who put questions ahead of time. We'll try to get to many of those, as well as questions that are submitted during this activity using the Q&A function. Those of you, I'm sure by now, are familiar with Zoom extensively. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, if you're using a screen version, or elsewhere if you're using your mobile phone, that Q&A box, which is where we'll take questions. And some of those questions will be factored into the conversation. Others may be answered just via the text function of the Q&A feature. We also have chat opportunities. We'll be using the chat function to share resources with you and links, but we also welcome you to enter things in the chat. In fact, I think Chelsea will prompt you to do some things chat-wise, just again, to give us a little better information about who's on the call today. I want to just say 2 words about NASB. We are the National Association of State Boards of Education. We're nonpartisan, nonprofit, and we're the only organization focused on supporting the citizen leaders who generally are the ones that serve on state boards of education in their work to strengthen the public education systems of their states, so every student, regardless of their background and circumstances, is prepared to succeed in school and work and life. Most of you know your state likely has a state board of education. It sits in that policy-making space, usually between the legislature and in support of the work of the state education agency. They are engaged in a variety of activities: strategic planning, developing accountability systems, teacher and educator licensure and certification, and much more. And it's really in that teacher, educator, licensure place that we have this convening today, because a lot of state boards will be charged with setting standards for what principals should know and be able to do, along with what they do for teachers and others. Hence, the title of this webinar, Rethinking the Principalship, Key Considerations for States. NASB has long been a Wallace grantee and a very strong advocate for those policies and practices that create the conditions for there to exist high-quality principals and high-quality principals in every school. And one of the things we work towards is, raising our own awareness about what those policies are. We tip our hat to the Wallace Foundation because some of the best research, this has been a focus area for the foundation for many, many years, and they've been supporting excellent research that has helped inform policymakers and practitioners and others in terms of what are those things that we can do to create the conditions to support excellent principals. And so that's what this webinar today is going to circle around. We are always strengthened by our partners. Our partners today are the Aspen Institute, the reason we value partners is because we're always going to be stronger when we have partners to work with us. Let me touch on a couple of norms for today's conversation. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available and distributed. Closed captioning has been enabled. Microphones have been disabled, so you really can't use your microphone. This is also a public webinar that's open to the media, and it's one of NASB's what we call our 2-part webinars. We're going to start with this open webinar here where all of you are in attendance. That's going to run from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock Eastern time for 1 hour, and then it will be followed by a NASB member-only session from 4 to 4:30. That will, if you're a NASB member, a State Board of Education member, stay on the line and you'll be given instructions for how to make that transition. I also want to make mention that part of NASB's work has included a couple of publications. Most recently, we issued a publication called Strengthening the Principal Pipeline Through State Leadership Academies. This publication features a number of states and their specific actions and not only policies, but practices through leadership academies to strengthen the principalship in their particular states. And I commend it to you because it's really, if you're looking for examples of states that are leading the way, this publication does a really great job of that. That was done in February of this year. In February of last year, 2023, we issued a publication called Preparing Principals Through High Quality Internships. This was based on some information that we had gleaned about states that had instituted these opportunities for principals to have a sort of internship experience as part of their teacher principal preparation work. And we thought that was worthy of highlighting, and you'll find that in that document. The other thing I want to highlight is NASB has a principal collaborative. We found that there are a number of State Board of Education members who either are sitting principals or have previously been principals. And wouldn't it make sense to bring them together wearing both their hats, their principal hat and their State Board of Education hat, to help us navigate through educating our members, sharing research, analyzing best practices in this space of state policy that enables high quality principals. So our principal collaborative is in many respects sponsoring this experience because this aligns beautifully with the work they do. I can't tell you how much I love this topic, and I'm not going to say very much because I'm such a believer in strong principles making a tremendous difference on the quality of education being delivered in our schools across the country. I have visited many schools in my career, and you always know when you're with a school that has an amazing principal, there are those tells. You know, the teachers are talking about how great it is. There's a cultural vibe. There's energy around the mission of the school and a cohesiveness about everybody working together towards a common goal. You might see data on the walls. You might see inspirational activities. You might see students that are doing things that are strongly supported by the principal as part of an overall improvement strategy. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to our amazing partners at the Aspen Institute Education and Society Program. I'm pleased to introduce to you Chelsea Chang. She's the Senior Practice Associate and is essentially leading the Aspen Institute's work in this principal space. They've done a lot of amazing research that has helped inform what NASB is doing, and frankly, not just for NASB, but across the nation. And we felt like this is great stuff, and we want to share it more broadly. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over, Chelsea, to you.
Thank you so much, Paulo. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started together. And let me know if you all can see that.
We can.
Great. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Chelsea Chang. As Paulo mentioned, I'm the Senior Associate at the Aspen Education and Society Program. I'm eager to be here with you all to talk about Aspen Education and Society's years-long work around the principal. So before we go ahead and get started, I'd like to get a sense of who's in the room and where you're calling in from. So please share your name, and if you're part of a State Board of Education, please let me know what state you're representing. If not, I would love to hear what organization you're representing. You can go ahead and start typing. At Aspen, we very much agree. We do not believe in sit and gets. We like active participation. So throughout the presentation, we're going to have some reflection questions for you all, and would love to hear your reflections and reactions via the chat box. So I'll take a minute to let folks go ahead and share their responses, and then we can move on. Great. See some Washington, D.C. folks, some Delaware folks. Guam. Wow, thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and keep us going, but please feel free to continue putting your answers in the chat. All right. So speaking of Aspen, I'd like to share a little bit about our organization and what we do. We work with education leaders across policy and practice to improve public education outcomes by informing, influencing, and inspiring education leaders, ultimately with the goal of achieving equity, particularly for our students of color and for students from low-income backgrounds. And this happens across two teams on our organization. We have a policy team that develops curious and vulnerable spaces for federal and state policymakers teachers to learn about education policy and research, to create more informed, equity-centered policymaking, and then our practice team, where I sit, which convenes system leaders and their partners across the country and connects them to bellwether research and practice to ultimately improve their systems. Before I dive into the principalship, I'd like to elevate a document that serves as an anchor to a lot of our work. In 2022, we published We Are What We Teach, which outlines a new vision for public education. We spent time examining years of educational context, research, and literature to understand where our education system was and where we wanted it to be. This new vision aims to be responsive to the current realities of schooling and society writ large. The vision integrates academic excellence with a more humanistic approach for what students need in their places of learning. The paper proposes three foundational purposes of public education. In other words, what do we want students to be able to do and have and say after they leave our K-12 systems? And we believe that schools should provide students with a healthy sense of self, strong skills to participate in the future of work, and a commitment to democracy and the democratic process. So then we began to focus on improvement strategies that could make a rich vision possible. But we realized that we couldn't do this and we couldn't talk about changing the purpose of school without talking about the school leader. So for several years, our policy and practice team has been deeply engaged in understanding the role of the principal at a micro and a macro level. This work began in 2019 with the principal working group and has evolved and taken several other forms, including a podcast. We're now at probably 4 white papers, engagement with principal networks, and professional learning communities. We approach this work as a conversation between what is true about principal work, what are we hearing on the ground, and what is possible to truly transform school leadership in a way that research suggests would best support students and their outcomes. So at every juncture, we've had conversations with leaders, we've had conversations with principals to hear how they're reacting to what we're putting out, and then we make adjustments as we're going. So when we started information gathering for our first paper, Rethinking the Role of the Principal, we learned what I'm sure many of the people in this Zoom room may already know. Principals are doing far too much in their buildings. They're serving so many functions at the schoolhouse at any given time. They are building managers, making sure that the actual structure of the school building is up to date and clean and good for the students that are in the building, as well as the teachers. They're human capital managers. They're thinking about the development of the teachers in their building. They're instructional leaders. They're sitting in on learning walks and doing evaluations. They're community leaders. They're facing and talking to parents and students and community members writ large. And they're also public health officials setting and communicating these safety protocols. But having all of these hats and wearing all of these hats has a real effect on principals kind of across the country. Principals have reported feeling burned out and having high levels of stress. In 2022, we saw about 85% of principals reporting experiencing high levels of job-related stress, compared to about 35% of the rest of the population. And even before the pandemic, principals are departing at these really high levels, and we've seen that continue after the pandemic. A recent study by RAND showed about 16% of our principals are retired or resigning, doubling the rate from the year prior. And this has effects on the school as a whole. We know that when principals turn over frequently, student achievement decreases, teacher turnover increases, the workforce is less stable overall. And this has lasting effects, as research suggests, up to 3 years. Not to mention, as I'm sure the state boards here know, state board members know, it's costly to replace principals. It costs about $38,000 at a minimum to replace a principal in a building. So we had all of this data, but we wanted to understand how principals were feeling about their role currently and what are their aspirations for the role. So we conducted a principal focus group in December of 2023 and have continued to talk to principals across the country. And what we are hearing is that principals want to be instructional leads. They want to do the learning walks. They want to be in classrooms. That's where they want to spend most of their time. But because of all of the other hats that they're wearing, it's very difficult to support that kind of process. They said they know that community and cultural dynamics are extremely important to how the school functions, but that is a learned skill set, something that a lot of principals didn't know or weren't prepared for when they first walked into the role. And it requires a lot of time to do well. They also noted that there's incoherent and unequal evaluation structures and areas. So principals know that they need to focus on Y, but they're being evaluated on X. So they spend all of their time doing X, but they know that Y has the highest impact. And they also tell us that principal prep is not adequately preparing for them for the kind of dynamic leader they need to be in their buildings. And I put this quote up here, this last bullet. It says, if only policymakers knew what was on our plate. Because I think that this is a really important conversation for us to continue to have to make sure that we're creating policies that are responsive to how principals are living their experience every day. So I'm going to pause. Here's one of the reflection questions I promised you would come and ask you all, how does this align? How do the things that I've mentioned align to the challenges your principals are facing or challenges you faced as a principal? What are other challenges you've heard from principals in your context? Yeah, just curious to hear how other people, how is this resonating with the folks in the room? So I'll give a moment for us to chat and I'll check the chat box. All right, I know that fingers are typing or we have shy members, and that's totally fine. So I'm going to continue. Please feel free to drop your answers in the chat. Would love to hear what y'all are hearing in your contexts. I agree, Amelia. All right, so why does all of this matter? I've been sharing a lot about the challenging situations of principals across the country, but why do we want to zero in on principals? Why does their experience in particular matter? Well, the research is clear. Principals matter. Principals have a huge impact on student achievement and success. In fact, their effects are larger in scope than teachers because their impacts span schools rather than just classrooms. And I'll point to this quote from the seminal research about the principal coming out of the Wallace Foundation. Indeed, it is difficult to envision an investment with a higher ceiling on potential return than a successful effort to improve principal leadership. So taking all of this information, we published Rethinking the Role of the Principal, which outlines 6 shifts in principal practice. In other words, how do principals do their job and what do they pay attention to every single day? And shifts in the system. So what ecosystems surround principals? How does central office orient themselves towards protecting principals' time and what they know matters most? And we asked for that to reorient. We're asking for both of those systems to reorient to make the principal role more impactful and more sustainable. And state boards of education are a key part of this because they can incentivize and or create the enabling conditions for this type of alignment. So we'll spend some time going through the 6 shifts by both practice and shifts in the system. But what's important to note here is that while these shifts are parsed out into these perfectly branded, beautiful boxes and bifurcated by principal practice and systems that surround principals, they are in fact interdependent, and that's the way that we should view them. Systems must think of these as mutually reinforcing interventions and equally important to transform the principal role. So I'm going to start with the roles, the changes in principal practice. So what do principals, how they need to orient themselves, what our proposal is for how they orient themselves differently to support a stronger principalship. So our first shift that we propose is around championing a learning culture. We know that principals have to champion a learning culture in their school systems, and we know that they're also uniquely situated to do so. It might look like organizing their resources in their building toward developmentally appropriate experiences. It might be promoting culturally responsive teaching and learning, and it might be just developing the teachers in their building. And we know that being a lead learner is an important role for principals because research tells us it can be impactful for student outcomes. According to research coming out of the University of Chicago, principals most influence student learning by fostering that strong learning culture. Principals can lead initiatives that are associated with improving schools, such as teacher development, program alignment, and engagement with parents. They can also support a learning climate by empowering teachers to be leaders in achieving school-wide goals. So we know that principals can have an impact on developing a strong learning culture among school staff. However, we have to be able to set them up to do so, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about shifts in the system. The second shift in practice is around cultivating a positive school climate. We know that this is important for principals to do, and it is both different and related to a learning culture. This relates to how students, teachers, and school staff feel in a school building. We know that principals set the tone and, in some cases, monitor school climate measures within their school system. We also know that every person's experience in the school building matters. So care must be taken to create positive environments for both students and teachers. In particular, for teachers, research suggests that principals can have an impact on teacher experience. In fact, effective principals are associated with higher levels of teacher satisfaction and lower rates of teacher turnover, which can be really good for our students. And elements of positive working culture, including a positive school leadership, collegial relationships, and school culture, are of particular importance to teacher retention, all areas that we know that principals can have significant impact. As it relates to students, we've learned from our conversations with leading adolescent psychologists, Dr. Lisa Dumore and Dr. Lisa Ramirez, that the healthiest and most effective classroom environments are ones that balance psychological safety with high expectations. So if you're looking at the graph, it's that green learning zone. What that means is students need to know that they feel loved, that somebody cares about them in their school and in their classroom. And they also feel challenged. They know that their teacher believes in them and knows that they can do really well. And belonging is a key factor in psychological safety and in fact can predict positive educational and personal outcomes. And so what we know is that principals set the tone in their buildings, whether they do it on intentionally or not. We are proposing that principals need to be very intentional about this because they're uniquely situated to do so, and they're able to make sure that teachers are adopting this warm demander stance in their classrooms, and students feel safe and loved in their school. Together, these maximize learning and support for our students. The final shift that we propose in our Rethinking the Role of the Principal paper is around the orientation to the community. Principals are community leaders. Principals must take the time to ensure that there is a symbiotic relationship between schools and the communities they're situated in. This orientation helps principals become trusted leaders and advocates for their students. And research suggests that principals and intentional and strategic engagement with the community can have a significant impact on student achievement, belonging, and trust in the school community. We also know from research that when principals don't pay attention to this, when they don't have a culturally responsive knowledge, it can actually widen disparities, particularly for our most marginalized students. So principals must adopt this community-connected, culturally responsive leadership stance in service of strong schools, thriving students, and equitable environments. So after all this research, we knew that every move that a principal made in their building was impactful. The research base was clear. Principals are our community connectors. They're lead learners, and they are culture and climate curators. But principal practice alone cannot solve these problems, as I'm sure the principals in this room probably know. We needed to look at the systems that surround principals. So what are states doing, central office, and other leaders to create a space where principals can perform the highest impact activities in their building? Enter redefining the role of the principal. So Redefining the Role of the Principal was released in 2023 as a follow-up to Rethinking the Role of the Principal. It provided concrete examples of states and districts and education leaders who have redesigned their ecosystems to empower principals to be stronger, more effective leaders aligned to what the research says. So the first shift that I'll talk about with an example is around investing in authentic preparation. As we know, and as research has suggested, principal licensure exams do not measure a candidate's ability to be an effective principal and actually disproportionately bars Black and Brown candidates from the principalship. It also does not in any way predict principal job performance. So to prepare people to be a good principals, they need to be able to have these hands-on experience that align with the responsibilities of the role, similar to what Paulo was mentioning at the onset of this conversation. And so in our Redefining the Role of the Principal paper, we elevated Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education as an exemplar of authentic preparation. So Massachusetts DESE redesigned their principal licensure assessment to evaluate a candidate's readiness for school leadership through this portfolio model assessment instead of a sit and take a test. This portfolio model was called the Performance Assessments for Leaders, aka PAL. To pass the PAL, principal candidates engaged in a 500-hour practicum in which they were required to complete a number of tasks related to things that Massachusetts had decided were really important to the principalship. So they did things aligned to data analysis, to developing professional learning communities, to evaluating teacher practice and a community and engaging in community. So what those looked like in practice was data analysis. The principal candidates had to analyze district and school level data to determine an academic priority, create a vision, and get people to buy into that vision, similar to what a principal would actually do in their everyday job. They were also required to develop a professional learning community with a set of teachers within a school system. They were required to observe, assess, and provide feedback on teacher effectiveness. And they had to develop and execute a proposal for family and community engagement at their school site. In addition to these model, aspiring principals received a principal mentor on the ground who was providing them with real context on what it is to be a principal every single day. On top of that, Massachusetts had coordinated with public universities to offer leadership, who were offering leadership postback to aspiring school principals. And these schools now offer courses aligned to the performance assessment for leader tasks. And so they had an additional layer of support as they were trying to complete the PAL. And so really they were thinking about the full leadership continuum for principals. In a similar vein, Rhode Island, in partnership with Aspen, has been thinking about how they want to redesign their principal apprenticeship program and has leveraged the Department of Labor to create a grow your own model to provide that access to a high quality principal pathway. In this model, principal apprentice would in this model, as they're developing and building it out, they are having conversations with the community to understand what is it that a principal needs to do. What does a Rhode Island principal look like, and how do we design a pathway that is responsive to that? In this model, apprentices are getting hands-on experience as assistant principals and earning and learning. In particular, this assistant principal is really important because, as research has told us, the assistant principal is underutilized in the principal pipeline, and so this is a great way to create that through line. The second shift that we propose in our paper was around aligning the system to advance principal priorities, which basically means allowing principals to focus on what research suggests actually matters. And this requires a completely different orientation at the central office level, but also at the state level. It might look like outlining the portrait of a principal. What does an successful principal look like in Delaware, in Guam? And how do we update principal evaluation standards to support these aims? And DCPS is a great example of a change that they've created in their system to allow principals to focus on what really matters. They developed a role called the Director of Strategy and Logistics, and this role oversees all of the administrative and operational pieces of the school, allowing principals to take off that building manager hat a little bit more. So they may be the people who are overseeing school-based purchasing, buying the pencils and the paper and the furniture and all the other items that are needed to keep a school going. They may also monitor the building for cleanliness, physical condition, and safety matters, and organize janitorial staff to address any issues. Before this role was created, principals had reported spending nearly half of their time thinking about and performing building management tasks. After the role, principals have reported increased capacity in their buildings. And I will say, we've presented on this Director of Strategy and Logistics so many times, and this is the thing that makes all the principals' eyes light up. And so if you are trying to gain some brownie points with your principals, this is definitely a great way to go. And then our final shift, we propose supporting and evaluating the most important expectations for principals. As the old adage goes, what gets measured gets paid attention to. So principals must be evaluated, coached, and supported on the areas of their role where we know they have the highest impact. So culture, climate, academic gains, teacher practice. And for many of the districts, many districts, that means moving away from a culture and policies of compliance, of sit and get meetings where they're just told what they need to do, and rather converting those into targeted professional development, support, and additional scaffolding so principals can do what matters most. A great example of this is in Tulsa Public Schools, who has realized that the principalship needs additional scaffolding to make data-driven decisions in their building. So they've created at the central office level school partner teams that principals can pull on if they need support in anything related to data or content in their buildings. So these school partner teams consist of a school strategy partner who supports with making resource allocation decisions based on school level data and providing budgeting support. The talent management strategist who works to provide support around staffing, including teacher contracts, retention efforts, recruitment efforts. There's a data application partner who offers guidance on data and education technology platforms to enable teaching and learning, and an academic partner who analyzes school achievement data to adjust for strategic planning. When principals will meet with these school partner teams bi-weekly, and then they will use all of the data and the support that they get from their school partner teams to strategize and make decisions for how they will improve outcomes for their students. Then principal supervisors will follow up with those principals to ensure like a small A accountability on the plans that they set forward with their school partner team. In this model, we see that principals are focusing on teaching and learning, they're setting a vision for academic excellence in their buildings, and they're getting support from other experts who are willing to support at the central office level. Principals are then held accountable and evaluated based on those areas with their principal supervisors. So I've shared several examples of places making positive change to support the work only principals can do, but there are so many more out there, and I hope that your states can be part of the cadre of people and places thinking about how we rethink the role of the principal. I'd like to share just two papers that I've been talking about throughout this time. The QR codes are here, so you have the opportunity to read them or get a copy if you'd like to, and I think we're going to drop them in the chat. I'll also preview for you that we recently released another paper, we just can't get enough of the principles, focus on policies districts and states can make to adopt a better principal practice. As a teaser, some of the bold bets are outlined here. So the bold bets include better understanding the lived experience of principals so that it can inform policy making, creating policies aligned to the research on where principals have the greatest impact, developing a principal advisory council to pressure test policies, and there's a great example of that in North Carolina, and also developing state-based principal licensure exams like what's happening in Massachusetts. And we are hoping, I'm looking at Paulo, to have another presentation with NASB in the new year to chat about this paper and our recommendations for our policymakers. I hate to say goodbye, so I'm going to prolong it for as long as possible and ask one or two more reflection questions from our group to hear what you're taking away from this and what feels most promising in your principal work. What's resonating with you? And yeah, what are you thinking about? So I'll give some time in the chat for that. And I see lots of comments, so I'll go in and check those.
Chelsea, that was amazing. What a wonderful presentation. And I love that you're teeing up things to come because I think we could even, start unpacking that now. While people fill in some of and share some of their own experiences, I'm going to ask you a couple of the questions that have come in on the Q&A. Ken Simon asks, can we change the role of the principal without changing how schools are organized? Can we change the role of the principal without changing district principal school relationships?
I'm going to also bring in Gene, who is one of my partners in writing this, and so would love for him to jump in on this. But yeah, Gene, do you want to go first?
I'm muted. In 2020, that's my New Year's resolution. 2025, I will not be muted when I start talking. Wish me luck. So, Paolo, if I understood the question correctly, can we make these changes in one component without the other?
Right, right.
The answer is yes, but it's just not ideal. The way that I've been describing it is much of what we've seen here, and I'm sure people have seen this in their own districts. I remember this from when I was a principal. You can take these initiatives as a school leader in your building. And the best you're going to get is that people will leave you alone. What often happens is that you're swimming against the tide of other trends in your district. And similarly, if the district initiates changes but hasn't enlisted the principals in this new mode of operating, then it really dissipates the impact of any significant changes. So, yes, it can be done. And sometimes one is the cart and the other is the horse. Ideally, they should be moving in concert.
Yeah, I love the way you say that because as the presentation was unfolding, I kept thinking to myself, okay, how do we get this to pivot, right? And a leader could do it, a principal could do some of this themselves, right? But like you say, if they're stuck in an environment, their evaluation is on different things, their expectations are awkward, or they don't really have the body that they might need for support or logistics or whatever. But they can maybe find some things they can go so far. If a district decides then to say, look, we're going to be more deliberate about supporting our principals, and I think in addition to the state examples you have, I'm sure there are a number of really powerful district examples where they're strategically thinking about how do we take this precious thing that we have to deploy to get these schools running effectively and really let them focus on those things that they're going to be best at. And then the role of the state, right, at that next level is what are those state policy barriers or things that challenge the ability of districts and schools to be able to move in this kind of direction. And I think both your publications and what we've talked about here have supported that. Do you want to talk a little bit more about maybe the district role and the state role?
Sure, happy to do that. I guess I should also introduce myself. I'm Gene Pinkard. I'm the Director of K-12 Leadership at the Aspen Ed and Society program. Chelsea and I were co-authors, as she mentioned, on the second paper. I'm the author of the first paper, and my background is as school system cabinet leader and a principal and principal supervisor. Um, One of the things that we've seen, and I'm going to speak in broad terms, and I see some of the folks in the chat, like Paul Katnick and others who know as much about this or more than I do. Um, States create enabling conditions. They can incentivize some of the descriptions that Chelsea has offered. They can institutionalize some of them, and then on the district side, they operationalize them. So again, it's about coherence and congruence across the different layers of the system. That you need that between a principal and their central office in their district. You need that between districts and what's happening at the state. Um, the state also sends signals about what are priorities. I saw a comment in the chat about principals wrestling with growth versus performance in supporting folks who have alternative certifications. That's something where I think the state can play a role both in creating pathways for multiple pathways for professionals to get into the work, but then recognizing the differentiation that has to exist for those folks who are on the front lines of implementation.
Great, great. No, I think that's amazing. Um, uh, the other question that's been posted is, do you recommend these strategies for both public and charter schools? I mean, I guess my perspective is any school, right? Any principal, these kinds of things. I don't think your research differentiated between like, is it somehow different? I would even add private school. Is it somehow different in a private school? Is it somehow different in a charter school or a public school? I think anywhere where people are leading an educational experience, these kinds of ideas, both the challenges are very similar, and then the opportunities to change those conditions are as relevant. What do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just that so I was a principal of a charter school. I was a principal of a traditional school in a district. Um, some of the challenges are the same. Some of the challenges and contexts are very different. But real talk, some of the most innovative things that traditional districts are doing, they stole from charters who took the latitude to be innovative and think outside of the box. And conversely, we've seen charters as they grow from a single site to multiple schools recognize that there is some wisdom in having central office efficiencies that align to the practices that we're describing. So yes, absolutely relevant in both contexts. And I think folks will come at it from different angles through different challenges, but find some of the same values in what principals should be doing to move the school forward.
one of the questions that we had ahead of time was this idea of, we often think that we want the best principals in our lowest performing schools to help them improve, and yet we struggle to sort of recruit and bring people into those kinds of settings. Say a little bit about your take on that phenomenon. What are the kinds of things that create the conditions to attract high quality leaders into some of our most challenging settings?
The opportunity to make the decisions that make a difference. I think, the research on professionals in general it tells us about the importance of things like agency, feeling like you're actually making a difference, feeling like you're actually capable and competent for the work that you're doing. And so when we put principals in positions to like decide what to do with a mask mandate, and that wasn't part of what we learned in our training program, or you're asking them to just implement something without asking them about the implications of implementation, then you're really discouraging them from being the leaders that they've been hired to be. Chelsea, I welcome you to jump in on this, but that's the first thing that comes to mind for what makes a difference.
No, I don't think I have anything to add about what makes a difference. There is research about kind of what principals have asked for, and I know during the pandemic there was a lot of incentivizing around adding additional pay or giving folks mental health. But I think it is the balance, and that's what we heard from principals a lot is that they do want the balance to be able to be the leaders they want to be in their building, but then to also be able to go home and not have to work these crazy hours or feel like they need to be the person cleaning the gym after a game if the janitorial staff doesn't show up. I think that those are fundamental but very important to a principal's like well-being and ability to kind of have a work-life balance.
Yeah, I love what you said about autonomy, because I think, I know there have been districts that have used the portfolio schools approach, right? And each school you sort of invest in that principal and the school community broadly, that opportunity to define, what is necessary for them to be successful. Sometimes you put some guardrails in place, but you might give them control over budget. You might give them control over hire, the staff, because that team is so important that if you're given a team and you don't have an opportunity to kind of shape it, that can also influence the ability that you have to actually bring out your best leadership and to get the best out of the particular staff. Fern Desjardins from the great state of Maine asks, how does school size impact a principal's ability to make the shifts? Are small schools disadvantaged in making changes?
Yes and no. So if it's a small school in a district, that small school might really benefit from having a central office with some of those functions. And Paolo, the budget is a good example. The budget may actually be something, how do I put this? I'll put it plainly. There are things when we're rethinking the role of the principal that principals might not like, but in the long run could be good. So there are areas of budgeting that, yeah, how much time do you want your principal figuring out how much to spend on copy paper and toilet paper? That is not where we're going to get the
Right, right.
impact. And but to take that back and say we're not going to give that level of control to the school might have made me feel uncomfortable as a principal, but it would have freed up my attention elsewhere. And so I share that in relation to the small school, large school thing, because if you're a small school in a big system, then you can offload a lot of that stuff to the system. Small districts and small schools definitely have a different set of challenges. It takes a big district to reach the economy of scale to create a new role like a director of school logistics or to repurpose multiple administrator roles so that some are operational and some are more focused on culture and climate and community. Um, and academics, obviously. And so when you're in those smaller schools, it becomes a question not so much of, okay, somebody else can do this because there is nobody else, but it does still push the question of where are your priorities? What are you going to evaluate? What are you going to lead your conversations with in your community, so that you can keep your eye on the most impactful work?
Great, great. I also think, though, that sometimes there are disadvantages in a big school. You know, the larger the team is, the larger the enterprise.
Oh,
Does
yeah.
you really create? It takes that much more effort, perhaps, to get everybody cohesively, aligned and moving in the same direction.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. With small schools have the advantage of agility.
Yeah,
They're often
and
able
community.
to
Everybody can
instant
know
teamwork
everybody else
created.
in a small
Yep,
school.
that's right.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about principal preparation. One of the comments I wrote as Chelsea, as you were presenting, was about principal preparation, and because the three that you talked about, culture and climate, and I kept thinking, do good principal preparation programs actually deal in terms of how to address issues of culture and climate? Are we is part of the obligation to strengthen principal preparation, and what are the kinds of things we should be doing in that regard?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, one, I'll say I have not heard of any examples of any prep that is kind of focused in on that orientation toward community. I think Massachusetts is moving in that direction and continues to be an exemplar in that. And I think we have a Massachusetts rep in here, so shout out to you. And so that's I think that there's definitely some movement in the direction to help principals think about kind of how do I be a community leader, but I think, and Gina and I have talked a little bit about this. I think part of it is also you can't prepare for everything, and nobody could have prepared principals for a pandemic. But it's, there are like competencies that you can give principals to support them in becoming good community leaders. And I think, what we didn't talk about in terms of Massachusetts is, I interviewed principals who had gone through the PAL and they had said, we had some lessons about, how to have really difficult conversations. And we had lessons about kind of being reflective leaders. And those were really helpful when it started to come into dealing with a particularly challenging dynamic. And so I think there's some positive movement in that direction. But I don't know that that is, I hope it continues to move that way, but I don't know that a lot of prep programs have focused in on that in the ways that could be helpful.
Yeah. What about, one of the issues, it was both a question that came in with registration, but also Deborah Stevens from Delaware asked the question about individuals who don't have an education background. Can they become good principals? It seems like her question was, our state legislature is considering allowing individuals without an education background to become principals. They feel these people would bring greater creativity and innovation to the role. Is there any research that addresses this? And what are your thoughts about that kind of thing?
Makes me nervous. But I'm not going to dismiss it out of hand. We collaborate at times with an organization by the name of Instruction Partners, who's done a little bit of work on this. And I'm not going to do their work justice, but they had sort of three frames for the principalship. One is the principal, who is the instructional leader. They are in lesson plans. They are with teachers. They are the master teacher in the building. The second is the principal as the delegator, and they are working with that, but trusting their deputies and being close at hand with them on instructional leadership. And then the third is the principal as a manager who just knows that the expertise is in the building, but it is not their area of mastery. This sounds like that last one. Um, it, it, uh, I would imagine that we all have the same questions and wonderings. Perhaps this person would be thinking out of the box and bringing different leadership approaches. I think they would absolutely, as we can see from the research and what everything that Chelsea shared, you still have to understand how to interact with the community. You still have to understand leadership. You still have to analyze academic data, even if you're not a master instructor. So there are still some competencies that are, I think, non-negotiable.
Right. Well, and understanding good instructional practice. I think this is one of those where maybe like the Massachusetts model of prep, where it's deeply infused in practicum, or a mentor, a really strong mentorship program. I know I'm familiar with a program that was called Bright Leaders for Schools, that actually had sort of a year-long immersive approach to, non-traditional principles that showed some promise. But I think you're right. There are certain things about the fundamental operation that you need some knowledge of, and if there are ways to acquire that knowledge in a way that could equip you to be successful, that might work out. But yeah. So I think we are at time. I want to first of all thank Jean, you and Chelsea for joining us, and show my great appreciation for all the great work that the Aspen Institute is doing. I also, like to process things, and so, in terms of hopefully the takeaways you get from this conversation is, this is an important area that deserves focus. At the state level, at the district level, and at other levels. One of the things we didn't touch on, and maybe I'll end with this too, because part of this, we are seeing so much attention paid to teacher shortage, teacher retention. And actually, I think high quality principals are a key to creating the conditions to improve teacher retention, but we're not really focusing as much on principal retention, which I think can have all kinds of cascading benefits throughout the system. So hopefully one of your takeaways is, while your state may be engaged in lots of conversations around teacher retention, teacher quality, and what have you, that you spend also some time on looking at your state level data about, principal, the feelings they have about remaining in the job, principal retention, and creating conditions that can make these positions manageable and yet yield greater effectiveness. So commit yourself to learning more. Read some of the publications you've seen here. Ask some questions in your state about what you might already be doing. We probably mentioned maybe a half dozen to 10 states on this call, but it's worth your while asking what's going on in our state. What does our data show? Are we already trying to do anything? If we're not, who might we want to bring together to have some early conversations about this kind of thing? Is it principals associations? Is it principal preparation programs? Is it our big urban districts that hire a lot of principals and probably see a lot of churn? Is it our rural communities where it may be hard when a principal leaves to replace those principals? Who should be at the table? How do we inform those discussions? And then how do we sort of chart a course for what may be, first steps that we take and a long-term future that we want to engage in? With that, thank you all for participating in today's webinar. As I said earlier, we are going to pivot now. So for those of you